Satyanandam, Om Tat Sat. Om, bless this convergence in all its phenomenal aspecting, seen and unseen. Om, God directly speaking to God, about God, whether it seemingly feels as if it's indirect, but it is actually direct. Om. Om, the 11th live stream teachings of SATYAVEDISM. Om, entitled Om Satya, the Person as Pseudoegoing Process, Lssv 11. Om. I, the true identity as God, am not a person. This body hallucination that is being seen in God consciousness is not myself. God myself. And as it is actually being seen, it is a digital reconfiguration and representation of a body that seemingly might be appearing somewhere else in God infinity. So it is not even seemingly direct, but even that eventing would not be direct as well. So this is a digital representationing of another representationing that is, and both seemingly are God phenomenon. And the body that this is representing is basically a networking of processings, God manifesting in process as a seeming form that in reality is not delineatable. It cannot be taken out of context of the whole, and it has no real boundaries. Subquantumly at all. So it is very much illusory. And it is certainly not myself, my God self, God. Nor is it seemingly what is called yourself, which is the one I. So this I is referring to what I am, what you are. So you are not that body either. You are not any body appearing. You are not an object. You cannot be defined. You cannot be limited. God has no limitations, and that is what you are as God. So I am not this body. in what is being termed species fiction, the belief in bodies is almost essential, seemingly, for all to function, for all the functioning to occur. That somehow or other, this belief is prevalent, and that it is necessary, and that it is not even thought about. It is just taken for granted. But it is a false limitation of what cannot be limited. It really is a complete misunderstanding of the reality of what you are. The primary reason for all of this dissemination of misinformation is the language of relativity, which only reinforces it. All of these languages are relative and therefore fiction. And the use of these languages perpetuates that ignorance. So even though you, as God, can never be limited, there is a seeming hypnotism of limitation that is then processed and seems to function as such. So this linguistic investigation to deconstruct the falsity of the illusions produced by language, this must be investigated. It must be a primary investigation. And this seeming process of deconstruction. So it's basically linguistic deconstruction. But it also is deconstruction of actual seeming forms, so that those forms are no longer believed in visually as well. All seeming objects are denoted by words, by thoughts. When the thoughts are taken away or clear, there can be no referencing to objects, but the seeing without those thoughts no longer breaks apart, or seemingly breaks apart, reality. It is thought that does that, seemingly. So the dehypnotism starts with linguistic investigation of what you are not. You are not limited to a seeming object or appearance. So what you are, I, God, is effortless. There is no real process toward becoming God, because you have always already been God. You are always already what you are, despite any thought concepts to the contrary. So this is about no longer believing in these thoughts, and then about these thoughts, configurations, no longer reconfiguring. It is about the deconstruction of the actual thought content itself as well, and about the replacing thought with truth content that becomes apparent when the thought content is removed, when the fictional thought content is removed. So it is not replacing fiction thought content with other fiction thought content. It is about the actual removal of fictional content, dissipation. Now this can happen seemingly in one of two ways. The deconstruction can actually start to occur seemingly prior to the realization of what you already are. Actually, and or. It can seem to occur afterwards, after the realization, seemingly. Of course, there is no before and after. These are felt, but the feeling of that is within fiction itself. But in order to describe this pseudo-egoing, it is necessary to reach through fiction directly to convey this. In fact, there is no such process as self-realization or God realization. God alone exists. But as long as this is felt, that there is limitation on what cannot be limited, then the description of these processings are to elucidate what needs to be cleared. So God, you, are effortlessly omnipresent. The presence is felt in all, through all. God Omni is in it. God Omniscience knows all, because it is all God myself. And the Omnipotence is the infinite powers that are within myself, God myself. But it is all effortless. There is no efforting whatsoever. It is all inherently yourself. There is nothing that you can be but yourself, God. So seamlessly immanent within all, and also transcendent of all. God manifestation. God absolute is transcendent. God manifestation appears within God as God absolute. That is God omnipotence. That power of creating God's self out of God's self as the manifestation. That is how powerful you are as God. Effortlessly, effortlessly. What feels like work is actually effortless creativity with no exertion. So whatever seemingly feels exertion or tensions or frustrations or feelings that something that there is difficulty, all of that is pseudo-egoing. So this is already a description of what you are and what you are not. So absorb attentively without seeming resistance of pseudo-egoing. Impure God consciousness without any barriers or seeming blockading or any offensing or any defensing mechanism processing. You're disassembling. There's a disassembling seeming process. The process is disassembling it, the process, reconfiguring. So there is to be no identification with any thoughts that seem to claim individual agency, any personages, any endless narratives about a personal history that does not exist. There does not have to be a person in order for functioning to occur. For the seeming body, needs or functioning, it is completely unnecessary to have a belief in being a person in order for functioning to occur. This actually seemingly gets in the way of optimal functioning and health of the seeming body appearance. Thought mechanism can be used for endless creativity without in any way limiting it to false self-referential materials with thought content, reducing it. So the deconstruction of the pseudo-egoing can seem to occur that this God information is being given already as starting to replace the false content. And then that process seemingly will continue on the seeming other end when it becomes obvious what you are not directly, not in thought. And then then other truth content and processing will also disintegrate because of that realization as fallout from it. So the seeming processing, it's seemingly a before and an after. So there's no need to wait until the seeming after. The truth content is already being absorbed and the processing is occurring. It is activating. But any seeming personal history is blown away. Along with the false narrator in a dream, and the dream is blown away. What is called waking consciousness is just an extension of dreaming. The seeming state of being awake and the seeming state of being asleep, they're basically just continuous pseudo states. What is called waking, what is called being awake, is dreaming within fiction. It is not being awake. So all of that is blown away. Away. The pseudo states are blown away. It is all blown away. And it becomes obvious that you have always been what you are. Om. The scripture Lssv 68, to which this is in reference. So these 5 points of non-identification, linguistically and phenomenally, are being addressed. Lssv 68. Proceeding. Non-identification with limiting assertions. 1. False conceptualization. There is to be practice of non-identification, undefined and unbound by fictional concepts of being one person, individual, entity, or belonging to body, gender, race, species. 3. Group, collective, aggregate. 4. Country, planet, location. 5. History, period in time. You as God are none of that. These are all linguistic concepts, not referring to anything in God reality. So, 1. Person, individual, entity. This has been reinforced linguistically through words since the body appearance first seemingly appeared. And secondly, because of the body appearance, because of belief in the body appearance. So this twofold hypnotism is being addressed. It's already been addressed in many teachings. So in order to disidentify with what is fictional, when seeming thoughts are arising in God consciousness, there is investigation into their reality. The words, the thoughts. Now, in God consciousness, there are primarily 3 phenomena. There is wording, thoughts and words, the language that has been absorbed, has been taught. It usually does not occur in other languages, because those seeming other languages have not been learnt. Perhaps there are multiple languages that are seemingly learnt. So belief in what those languages are pointing to and representing, if that is the case, then multiple languages have to be not believed. They have not, those languages are not to be used for these purposes anymore. The languages need to be evolved and used for other purposes that are constructive and creative and not limiting. And the very languages themselves, those languages will be evolved, and new languages are to be created that represent God reality. Particularly the timelessness of God reality. Because relativistic languages use primarily tenses, time tenses that are not reality, past, present, future, that do not exist in eternity. God eternity the eternal now is all that any phenomenon ever exists in as God manifestation. So the usage of language to refer to past, present, and future, of memories and expectationing, or memorying, or expectationing, that does not reflect God phenomenon in God reality, in God actuality. So person is a process of false content. It's an accumulation of seeming memory processing, of phenomening. It's a retention of that information as referencing a particular appearance. And this processing that claims to be, the contents of which claims to be a self that is not real. It's a false claiming. The thought claims that there is a person, and the process uses the memories, the visual remnants, etc., to continue to construct an entity that is not actually there. So when there is investigation, primarily through what is called the meditation process, of going seemingly inward in the body, seemingly, to investigate the mechanics of the actual processing. and its search for, if the meditation process is used toward truth and not just to alleviate stresses of body functioning, but if the investigation is toward truth, then the mechanics of that pseudo-egoing become apparent. That it's actually just a process, and that it has no claim as being a person. All it is thought processing. So if there's believing in the pseudo-egoing as being an actual entity, then seemingly there's great limitation and felt limitation in the body processing. Now again, all that is seen is actually within God consciousness. It is not the other way around. It is not that consciousness is within the body as an epiphenomenon. It is the other way around. All that is seen is within God consciousness as its seeming contents that seemingly come and go, or seemingly can appear to be solid, even though that again is illusion. All of it is malleable. So in the investigation that takes place via meditation, this seeming self-inquiry, the real self, not the pseudo-self. The pseudo-self will fall away. It will dissemble. It is not there. There is only processing of thought and of images. Within meditation, it is to be seen that there are thoughts, images, and feelings, sensations. So again, the primary content is 1, thought, 2, images, 3, sensations. And that all of that is within consciousness. And all of that is within God consciousness, because it is not a limited content, local, seemingly local consciousness contained in a body. God in the form of means God everywhere, not just in a seeming form. It interpenetrates a seeming form hallucination. But it is omnipresent throughout all. So God in the form of does not mean God contained within a form. It means God that is omnipresent everywhere and cannot be contained, and pointing to a seeming hallucinatory form that is in fact not even a form. So there's the thoughts, the images, and the sensations. So those are investigated, and seen to be ephemeral, because what you truly are, reality, means unchanging. What seemingly is changing and impermanent is our phenomenon within it. but that subquantum homogeneous and the consciousness does not change. God Absolute does not change. The God manifestationing seems to shape-shift, transform, transmute. But ultimately it does not change. So the seeming phenomenon within God consciousness, when it is investigated as coming and going. So the pseudo-selfing process also is coming and going, even though it seems to be, with not investigated, seems to have a solidity to it. Seems to be habitual in some way. Seems to be able to be described when associated specifically with what seemingly is a body. But the body is basically an hallucination because it is not what it seems to be. And the pseudo-self is a processing that claims to be a self that it is not. It unbeknownstly is claiming agency of a self that it is not. It is seemingly prior to the true self, and that pseudo-egoing comes and goes. So it is not the real self. This investigation must be done in order to see through that, in order to really see the mechanics of the pseudo-selfing, and also why there is believing in what seems to be an external world and all of its phenomenon. The pseudo-selfing of seeming others, the belief in the bodily forms of others, seeming others that are not actually others. All is yourself. So every form that is seen that seems to be a body or a seeming person contained in a body or referred to as a person, the bodily reference point, the pointing to a form and saying that that is a person and that it has certain behaviors and seems to have certain history. The believing that there is relationship of persons, etc. When the one true self is the same in every seeming form. When all of those fictional beliefs are dropped, the self is the same. There is absolutely no difference. There is no duality. And not even about forms that seem to move around. But there is no duality of any other objects. There are no objects, including bodies. It is all within you as a seamless God reality. So there is no person, no individual, no entity, or persons, entities, individuals, etc. Because when one is seemingly seen through it, all of them that are yourself only, all of that is seen through, and those pseudo personalities disintegrate. Although there may seem to be reconfiguring of the processing within God consciousness, coming and going, that look like they are in the form of seeming others. But that processing and that information is seen through as not real. And the true self that is within all is seen directly within all. So it is, in a sense, it can be seen to be like X-ray vision, X-raying past pseudo-selfing as not existing, as not being real. So the body, again, that is a process, and the visual belief in it, the belief in it subsides. So any thought content, seemingly the use of language, when there are sentences or that seem to occur, that language formationing should be investigated. So if there is reference to a seeming person within a sentence structure, then it is fiction. It's that obvious. So when the thought content arises and it's referring to a pseudo entity, the person, then it needs to be dropped, and some other thought structure must occur to take its place, or the thought then or the thought is just dropped and not replaced in any way, because it is not necessary to describe fiction, to describe a shadow, a phantom that is not actual. So a lot of language can start to actually drop off, the usage of language. In fact, when there's realization, there may be the cessation of the use of language, unless it is absolutely necessary to be used for the functioning or some seeming purposes. And then it is only, it only comes out, it emanates when necessary to convey some information that needs to be exchanged, that needs to be transmitted and received. Pure functionality. else, there is a seeming stage when the non-use of language is perfectly natural. But if there is not feeling that, and one of the practices, one of the main practices of the integral methods of God realization is practice of silence. In order to start to withdraw all that language noise, if most of the content is fiction. So it's a pulling back. It's a quieting. And the use of language can start to trail off. So if there are thoughts and language usage, again, that refer to a person or persons, then either the thought should be dropped. It should be investigated, looked at for content, and then dropped. Is it about a person? Is it about, quote, myself as a person? To what self is the thought referring to? If it is referring to the pseudo-self, then it should be dropped. If it is referring to the pseudo-self of a seeming other, it should be dropped as well. This is in the investigation. Again, it is not within just meditation, or what is seemingly inward meditation. These processings of linguistic investigation and phenomenological investigation should occur seemingly while there are activities occurring. When the use of language is occurring, whether seemingly in a pseudo-self or the pseudo-self of a seeming other, that incoming language that takes place in God consciousness as well, because there's no dividing the pseudo-selfing of one with the pseudo-selfing of another. It all takes place within yourself, God consciousness, seamlessly. So there's investigation of the language of a seeming other going on as well. But in any case, this is about diminishment of the identification with what seems to be the primary pseudo-selfing phenomenon or process. So, one, again, is it about myself, the body? Because there is in fiction, the primary misidentification is with the body. There's the feeling of being the body. And the language reinforces that feeling of being the body. Almost all self-reference has to do with the body. So it's to what self is being referred, the body self. Well, then it's false. Or the self being thought about within the seeming mind, being imagined, the imaginings of what the body is going to do at some point, what it has already done at some point in a past that doesn't exist, where the body is going to go to do something or other in the future that doesn't exist. So that referencing is false. That is the referencing, the thought process, thought content referencing of the pseudo self that does not exist. Again, belonging to a body that is not myself, not limited to any particular body. I am everything and all the bodies within, all kinds of bodies, rocks, trees, various forms that are all basically not divided. So there is no, if there is a reference to a particular body as being myself, then it is incorrect. So that thought has to be dropped. Now, in God language, in referring to all of this non-identification, in God language or God lang, there are ways to express the seeming parts of God manifestation as being aspects of God, and therefore God is running through all of these denotations seamlessly, explicitly. So it is another form of the dehypnotization where there is non-identification with pseudo entities, but God Lang is putting all the forms together. In this, the referring is that all of that, this, that, the other seeming form is God. This is God. That is God. God is doing this. God is doing that. So therefore, it is the language is a reflection of the whole that God is, and it is expressing that explicitly. So thinking with the assistance of God lang, and then there's to be Sevban, which is which means God language in Lojban, which is a constructed language, etc. The usage of God lang can be in conjunction with these deconstructive processings, so that if there is wanting to use language, then that language can be used to be thought, for thought, to either replace the relativistic language, which is false, but it need not, at least at, say, a certain point in these methods, the usage of these methods can be coincident, can all be used together, or they can be used sequentially or separately, or etc. So in any case, the investigation about the 5 main aspects of what you are not can or cannot include the use of God lang. So in any case, 2, So the body, reference to an individual body is false and should be dropped. So when a thought comes up about the individual body, it should be asserted, no, I am God, I am the whole, I am not a limited individual body. I am not the body that is being referred to. Therefore, the thought should be dropped. Simply, and then it just fades away. So next thought comes up, could be about something else. Now, so every occurrence of a thought seeming to arise, it can, the investigation, this 5-part investigation basically, it is meant to be very simple, and it covers very much of thoughts that would arise, the content of which. So again, 2 is, say, gender. So gender is a limiting concept that does not exist. So what does it refer to? It seems to refer to a body, which I am not. So does the body seem to have a gender? Yes, it might, yes. Biologically, there is functioning that, and then when a body appears in the fiction society, there's an indication of what gender it is. Why is that necessary? Basically for medical purposes. God in the form of medical information that it might be pertinent to. Is it natural bodily functions of reproduction of bodies. But is that myself? Am I a gender? Am I God, the whole consciousness, pervading all, a gender? No. So that idea should be dropped. It is a limiting factor. It is a limitation put on the unlimited. So it does not refer to my true self. So cast that aside. Unless it's medical purposes, it needs to be addressed as being relevant or pertinent information in God and the happening of medical purposes, where perhaps a seeming form needs to be filled out and information given about a body, etc. There are other purposes as well. But it is not myself. I am not limited to, and I am not a gender. Race, so say ethnicity or whatever, having to do with the color of the skin or seeming genetics. So within relativity, within fiction, those seeming ideas, those concepts are being transcended, even within fiction, as being not important. Unnecessary segregation of, and basically meaningless. Again, though, in referring to the true self, is the true self of a race? No. Again, that seems to be pertinent to a body that I am not. So they're all, these concepts are interrelated, and they're all refer to the pseudo-ego, the pseudo-egoing fiction content. So if they don't refer, again, if it's not referencing the true self, then it's dropped. Species. So this causes major hypnotism. Again, species then refers to body consciousness. That form seems to be different from some other form. Even it seems to be different from a seeming other species form. But I am the God consciousness that pervades all of those seeming forms. I am the same consciousness that pervades all of those forms, whether it seems to be in one species or another. So it's a false reference. It's a reference to the pseudo-self that does not exist. It needs to be dropped. So as these thoughts are dropped, they come up, the thoughts come up, investigated and then dropped. At some point, the thoughts will come up and they just won't be believed. And as this processing goes on, the thoughts will, they'll start to not be believed. They won't, and the thoughts will not even have to be investigated. The process will become so. The process will become effortless. There won't have to be pause and thinking about it. It'll just be, just this, that, this. Not myself. Not myself. Not myself. It's not about me. It's not about God myself. If it is not referring to God myself, then why should it be said? It's misidentification. So why would God myself speak directly in a misidentified way, or think directly in a misidentified way? It becomes perfectly obvious what I am not. That all of that is existing within myself, yes. I am the fiction as well. Yes, I am all manifesting. I am all phenomenologic activity. I, God myself, am all of it. But God is not limited. I can never be limited. I, the true I. And I should be used only to refer to the true I, God I. Otherwise, it is referring to the pseudo-selfing and is a misidentification. Now, referencing SSSV 58, and then we'll go back to the other, the 5 and continue. But it needs to be expressed that SSSV 58 is regarding the elimination of pronouns that are referencing the pseudo-selfing. So in order not to encourage the pseudo-selfing to continue, the misidentification with the false self, the pronouns must be eliminated. And yes, there can be speaking using languages and the relative languaging, without the use of pronouns, the primary pronouns, and still be expressive. It is possible. It's very possible. But it is learned. It may seem difficult to the pseudo-selfing. It may seem very difficult to speak that way. But with much practice, it becomes effortless. And it has much effect on reducing pseudo-selfing, the belief. So the main pronoun is I, but it is not referring to the real I, usually. So it must refer to the true I, God, I, and not refer to the pseudo-self. So when the use of I, when it is used, it must refer to the true self or else not be used. There can be seeming what is called third person. It's not person though, but it is called that, unfortunately, in linguistics. Again, linguistics is to evolve. So even the meta usage of words expressing the thought content about linguistics, that is to evolve. So I refers to the true I, or else it is not used. Me, you, he, she, we, they, all of those pronouns are referring to, almost exclusively referring to pseudo-self. Pseudo-selfing, because there is no pseudo-self that can be referenced. It is a pseudo-selfing process. It's a processing that reconfigures based on false ideation. So there is no me, there is God, myself. Again, in Godlang, some of what seem, there are what are called a few, what seem to be pronouns that are actually used in Godlang, I, myself, etc. They are self-reference to the true self, God. But most of the pronouns, etc., are dropped. These false these pronouns that are pointing to fiction. So you, there is no you. But in these teachings, the you is capitalized as God you in order to be able to refer to you as God without saying I and having it misunderstood as referring to only one. See, this is how language can obscure. So it is used only as a tool within the teachings, but it is not used within Godlang, basically, because I is used in Godlang as what is you. So lowercase u is no longer used. These pronouns must go. He is a pronoun that has a gender based pointing to it. So in other languages, there are some other languages where there is no differentiation of gender. There are very few of them, of those languages, but there are. So he, she, those are pseudo self fiction. We is pseudo self fiction. There are no multiple selves within myself. It is only one I. There is only one identity. So there is no we. So even referring to we in order to be unitative is fiction. So we goes. They goes. They. There is no they. There are no others. There are no others. There is no they. There's no blob of they. There is no differentiation of they. It doesn't exist. It's just an idea that is false. These are erroneous ideas. There is no reality to these words. None. So they should be, these words should be dropped. Now, if there is usage in Godlang to refer, then the referring should be directly to what is called noun. So now all nouns are verbs. There's all, nouns are actually verbing. So everything really is basically verbing. It's inging. It's processing. Everything, all objects are processings. So there are not, again, linguistically, the evolution will be that there are no nouns. Right now, in eternity, there seems to be the usage of, in languages, nouns and verbs, etc. Ultimately, there will be no nouning. Now, then there are other words like mine, referring to me. Since there is no me, there is no fictional me as a thing, then there is no mine. The use of mine as a word is very important to drop, because much of the conflicting that occurs in fiction has to do with the pseudo-selfing and its possessioning. So when something seemingly becomes mine, it's a limitation on everything else. It's mine in particular. It doesn't belong to you, it belongs to me, it's mine. So there's the dissociation of with everything else, and the possessing of, the seeming possessing of something that doesn't actually exist by something that doesn't actually exist. All of it is God. It belongs to God as God. It is God. So the small mind is an imagination. It's an imagining that something could be reduced to being possessed by something that doesn't actually exist. It all becomes ridiculous, in other words, ultimately. These words are not referring to anything real. So mine has to go. Yours has to go, because it doesn't refer to anything real. His, hers, again, gender referencing to some that doesn't exist, distinguishing between another and myself that doesn't exist, separation, separating, seemingly linguistically separating what cannot be separable. Ours seems to be unitive, but again, there are no multiplicities that could claim ours. There are no aggregates. Theirs points to theirs not being mine, or whatever, etc. All of this is the pulling apart of, the seemingly pulling apart of reality, making distinctions that are not real. So the use of these primary pronouns, etc., and possessives basically continue to reinforce the pseudo false personas that don't exist, and the distinctioning of basically me and others, and the multiplicity of those aspects. Again, the diversity that only seemingly ocularly, visually exists, but as illusion. So the dropping of those, the progressive elimination, it can seem to be very difficult to drop them, to drop these words all at once. So the most optimal way of approaching this is sort of one by one, and there should be it's difficult because there seems to be a hard wiring. The usage of these words in the neural networking, etc., seem to be burnt in, or the pathways of neurologically. So it's it is a reconfiguring of neurological networks as well, in changing language usage. But this must occur in order to toward the dehypnotization, because the realization could occur without this linguistic restructuring, but language still has to be used for many constructive purposes. So it is not about having language no longer be used. Language must evolve. It must not be discontinued. So this work, this effortless work, must be done, because when the self, when it becomes very apparent what the self actually is, that God must speak, true self. The true self must speak about God reality, and not speak in fiction. So the elimination of pronouns is the first step, seemingly, and seemingly difficult step. So again, that's SSSV 58 to refer as reference. It needs to be elucidated at this point. Now, 3, in non-identification, with limiting concepts, limiting assertions, or assertions about limitation. Group, collective, aggregate. Again, the pronouning is already expressive of this. the pronouncing needing to be dropped. So when thoughts come up, bubble up in God consciousness, whether they seem to be referring to a a local pseudo-egoing or a non-local pseudo-egoing, like, equally can be investigated because they're appearing in God consciousness. Group, collective, aggregate. Since I am not a body, then I am not belonging to a group, any group. So if there is any labeling about seeming groups, say in fiction, what is called politics or communities or schools, classes, anything, the grouping seems to be endless. The referencing to groups, since there's the bodies seem to like to congregate, etc., then there is the collective pseudo-egoing. There's thought content that likes to encapsulate these gatherings and label. But then there becomes belief in those seeming gatherings. And they're considered groups or, again, collectives, aggregates, the coming together of multiplicity into a certain configuration. And then labels are assigned. And then those labels can start to create a us versus them, pronoun, referring to fiction, mentality or concepting. And this is where language becomes a primary source of all seeming troubles in the seeming world. The use of language to specifically to the creating of groupings. This group, not that. I'm not part of this group, I'm part of that group. I, the pseudo-self, body, belong to this group, but am not part of that group. Why would this body want to be part of that group? And all the various fictional differentiation. So again, the thought content, the thoughts arise about some group or another, and the belonging to. And all of that is the continuation of dreaming endlessly. I have no identification with any particular group. I am everything. I am all. I have no particular perspective. So all of this ideation, all of the pseudo-selfing of, say, in what is called politicking, politics, in fiction of the Democrat or this party, that party, and all the conflicting that comes of that, all the polarities that are not real, come from the differentiation, especially linguistically, and create us versus them mentalities that are not true, are not real, that keep the hypnotism going. So I am not a body. I am not a part of a group. None of that refers to me. Me, God. Capital me. Capital I, capital me. God, myself. So when the thoughts arise, some group or another, is this about Republicans? It's not about myself. Is this about Democrats? Not about myself. This is about independents? Not about myself. None of this is about myself. It's all fiction. This will start to become very obvious. But in the processing, it might be very difficult because all sorts of thoughts are going to keep arising over and over and over and over and over again, and keep having to not identify with them. Now, this is not what in what is called basically species fiction or species consciousness or body consciousness or whatever, that all of the linguistic programming seems to be so ingrained that there might actually be a struggling, a battle, a seeming battle that might actually go on of fragmentary pseudo-selfing. So that of believing, when the beliefs start to be dropped, there are other beliefs that might come up in the form of thoughts that are going to that probably are going to fight with this. They're going to try to defend the pseudo-self. The pseudo-selfing is going to try to defend the pseudo-selfing because it does not want to cease. There is real believing that it is actually real and that it is actually a person and that these concepts are actually real. So there may be a battle that takes place where the pseudo-self is going to fragment and there will be multiple processings going on to try to fight it. So the seeming body might become very uncomfortable during this investigation. Or perhaps not. It might be relatively easy. There are all sorts of phenomenon that might occur. But this God information is direct. It is God truth. So this seeming process is clearing the way, seemingly. It's going to be breaking down the pseudo-structuring. And so this investigation must continue no matter what thoughts are arising. Because if those thoughts are not referring to the real self, and not referring to real phenomenon, and are just projections, dream projections, then it does not serve any real purpose. It is illness and it needs to be cleared. 4, country, planet, location. Again, all the major conflicts that occur due to linguistic distinctioning and phenomenological seeming bordering that is not real. There are no borders that are referring to seeming geographical locationing in infinity, in boundless infinity. So I am not limited, God, I am not limited to a particular planet. The planets, all of seeming planets within myself are simply given names or labels in order to refer to one orb or another. To create conceptual mapping of real structuring. So there is functionality in that way. Again, a lot of God in the form of science uses certain terminology to just refer to certain structuring or goading, God omnimathing structuring. So there can be referencing to planets, but ultimately those forms collapse within myself subquantumly. But the pseudo-self, again, the references to what does this refer? So this would refer to a body on a particular planet. And since I am not limited to a body, I am not limited to a planet. And the planets are within seeming galaxies, and the galaxies are within seeming, it's just endless. The forms within forms within forms within forms. So all of that becomes about perspectivism, and from what perspective, though? There are no multiple perspectives. It is all the one self, myself, God, myself's perspective, which is a non-perspective. All multiple perspectives basically are illusory. And all relativity, when there is only one subject, collapses into absolute. Nothing is relative to anything. So I, the false self, does not belong to a planet. It is not in a location. Local to what? So I am everywhere. I, the true self, am everywhere. There is non-locality. I am everywhere all at once. So location does not refer to God myself. Planet does not refer to God myself as being limiting. Country is an illusion based on artificial borders that do not exist. It's all consensual dreaming as to what seeming land belongs to what, and what other land belongs to whatever, and whatever labeling that does not really exist. So in Godlang, that can be, country can be denoted as in God infinity, with the emphasis being on infinity. So they're emphasizing that there's no limitation. It's just a pointing to something. But all the battling, the seeming battling that takes place in fiction about country borderings and identity with country, national, what's called nationalistic identity, with belonging to a country and being proud and all of that. All of that is learnt fiction. All of that is pseudo-selfing, having been given the inputting of fictional data that gets reconfigured, the information is pulled up into God consciousness in what seems like present. And all of the struggles that seem to come from all of this differentiation, all of this misidentification. So it's misidentification within misidentification within misidentification. Multiple misidentification that configures the fictional projectioning. It's all reinforced. Must be true. Everyone else seems to think it's true, quote unquote, etc. Groupthink. All of this misinformation about God reality. And then 5, history, period in time. History. So history is species fiction. It's usually very self-referential. So a species does not exist as species centrism. Species centrism basically is what is called history, documentation of events that somehow or other, seemingly within the dream, the pseudo-egoing gets all of this information about what seems to have occurred in a past that doesn't exist, and then continues to push that forward into a future that does not exist, and all of that hypnosis only continues more hypnosis. So with history or time, first of all, there is no time. Time is a concept. So all use of calendars, etc., all the use of breaking reality up into, trying to break eternity up into pieces. Again, the devices that refer to time, what is called time, may be very useful for certain eventings to occur, but the belief in time, again, it causes more dreaming, the dreaming phenomenon. There is no time. It becomes very apparent once there is a withdrawal from concepting, time concepting, that it does not actually exist. It's not real. History, it must be emphasized that phenomenologically there are events that occur, that have seemingly occurred. Although all of this is God's sponge sinking, it all happens at once, all at once, always. So what seems to have been an event that happened in the seeming past is still continuing. It is still happening in eternity. So it is not happening in the past. Nothing happens in the past. There is no past. There is only eternity. So all of this is endlessly happening. It is happening eternally. So there seems to be the events that occur, phenomenological events. But all of this eventing is affecting everything else, all other eventings. Now, eternally. So the chronicling of seeming history, or those seeming events that occurred, that is not problematic. And for science, for scientific purposes, it's necessary. But all of the value judgments, the chronicling of all the value judgments, all the projectioning about those events, just continues the species fiction, as those judgments about those occurrences are not true. They can never be. Those judgments can never be true. It's false conceptualization. So what really needs to be preserved in some way might be the information about actual phenomenological events. And that's all. So belief in the meaning of, somehow or other, the meaning of those events has to be dropped. Because all the stories and narratives about history is not truth. It is dreaming. All of it. Judgment is divine ignorance. It is ignorance of reality. It is ignorance of truth. And perpetuating all that information only continues fiction. All of this information is false. What happens is real. The stories about it are not. The narratives about it are not real, because they are coming from pseudo-egoing and collective pseudo-egoing and species fictioning, and all of that combined projects non-reality on reality and seemingly then obscures it. So these ideas, when the ideas arise, the ideas must be dropped as false. So of these 5 categories, these are primarily most of ideas, most of false conceptualizations are comprised of these misidentifications. But the primary misidentification is with what the self is. The primary misidentification is the pseudo-selfing process. And all of the other identification branches out from that. And all that information is incorporated basically. And what it's eaten up, it's retained and processed so that the pseudo-selfing has a whole contextualization of falsity to refer to. Thus continuing to assert the pseudo-self as being real, and all of the other fiction as being real. It's a whole system of imagining, a false imagining. So there has to be non-identification with the assertions, with these various assertions of limitation, be it seemingly local to the pseudo-self or non-local to the pseudo-self. What seems to be in or what seems to be incoming or whatever. Again, there's no in, there's no out, there's no direction, there's no locality. But what seems to feel like that. So when these thoughts are arising, they seemingly be arising from an interior perspective or an exterior perspective or whatever. Actually, none of that is real. All of it is arising in God consciousness, uniformly, seamlessly, with no differentiation whatsoever. But there's a pseudo-egoing processing that's claiming that seems to be getting in front of, although again, there's no directioning, but seems to be getting in front of the real self and claiming it for itself. And that is not what you are. You are not that process. You cannot be limited to that process or seemingly mass processing. Yes, I have to break through all of that illusion to get to the reality that you already are. Already are that. So this is very important because thought affects language, and language affects thought. And the thought processing, it is not about getting rid of thoughts. God thoughting and God's speech is necessary. It is a gift from God. It is gifting from God. It is about true communication. And God's silence is underlying it all. So the investigation, it has to go into the God silence, the silence that is in all, that permeates all speech and all thought and all ideas, all sudden flashes of ideas, etc. Now also ideas, the actual visualizations can be dropped as well if they're referring to the false self in a way that creates more pseudo-selfing. The images and sensations in our thoughts are not the seeming source of seeming problem. There are no problems. Seeming. It's the misidentification. And then the perpetuation because of misidentification that and also this processing, it starts to disintegrate. It deconstructs what is, it becomes clear what is false, what is not true, and what is true. It becomes obvious what you thought you were is not what you are. It's not. And then there might be investigation of what seems to be a personal history then, and that falls apart. If it falls apart, is not true. That is why with the pseudo-selfing, that his personal histories can be rewritten because the ideas are reconfiguring. That leads to what is called shadow working, where there's endless reconfiguring of the pseudo-self in order to get some sort of relief from seeming past historical events in a pseudo-personal timeline that does not exist. And all of that, what is called sort of psychological working, is still within the dreaming, and it continues and prolongs the dreaming instead of being able to actually see through it and break it apart and have it is not referring to the real self. So it just prolongs the fictioning. It gives the pseudo-selfing more information to continue to reconfigure and rearrange, and more narratives and more stories in order to bend and morph. But the fact is that none of it is true. Seeing through it all, directly, or what is called realization, but God direct. It blows all histories away and heals what seems to be a body of all of the seeming stress that the body seems to have been put under through all of the belief and all of that fictioning. That is the way to heal. not to reconfigure the dream. Reconfiguring the dream is not going to, is ultimately not the solution to what seems to be a problem that does not exist. So start this process of linguistic deconstruction, which directly refers to what seems to be seen and thought, and investigate these 5 main categories of pseudo-self identification. Identification within identification within identification, all being false. Sort of go through these layers and cast off these thought formations. Basically, be the witnessing consciousness in this process. Of course, you are above being a witness. But observe in God consciousness thoughts arising from whatever seeming source, in whatever sensory input seems to be that is not. Because all senses, all bodies, everything is within God consciousness that you are. But when thoughts are arising from whatever seeming source, simply go through these 5 categories and ask, is this myself? Is this thought referring to my real self, God? And if it is not, then drop it immediately. Is it about a country? Drop. Is it about a particular group? Drop. Is it about so-and-so? Drop. Drop. Drop it. It is not about you. God cannot be limited by language, by anything. It is not about you. All is within you. God Omni is within God. There must be not believing in these limiting concepts. All functioning is effortless. God functioning, God manifesting is effortless. It does not need these linguistic constrictionings that are not limiting. God does not have to think this way. It is completely unnecessary. So assert the identity as God, as what you are. Assert the true identity and discard any identification with what is not true. Misidentification. So again, refer to scripture Lssv 68 and Lssv 58 and use these scriptures in conjunction. If there is struggling because there is disbelief that this could actually be true, but if this process is taken on and there is conflict with it, know that the pseudo-egoing is what is in struggle. Because that feeling of being a person can feel very strong. It can feel very strong. Or if there are ideas coming up already in conflict with it, know that that is pseudo-egoing as well. Even hearing about it, even hearing about this process might cause conflictive thought processing about it. But that is the pseudo-egoing trying to put up resistance, trying to blockade or trying to protect the continuance of that processing. But God omnipotence is much stronger than any such process. So if there's what is resting in God consciousness, but there is no real self that is resting in anything. It is simply God consciousness itself. So when those thoughts, when the pseudo-selfing is arising with those thoughts, with the thoughts of conflict about the process, no, this can't be true. This cannot be true. Quote, everything I've ever known is how can that not be true? Quote, unquote. Quote, everyone else is thinking that way. Everyone else is acting this way, quote unquote. Or, quote, am I going to be alone when I am realized and see this way, quote unquote. No, that's the pseudo-self speaking as still the pseudo-selfing. The pseudo-selfing is not going to be alone. The pseudo-selfing is not going to be alienated by this processing. But the pseudo-selfing is to disappear. It is to disintegrate. It is to be vaporized. Because what you are is unlimitedly so much more than any little teeny weeny little processing occurring. So it's not about trusting in a process. It is knowing. You already know what you are. Whether there seems to be awareness about it or not. You as God know what you are. So use this process toward linguistic dehypnotization and phenomenological dehypnotization. You're not a person. You are not the body. You do not belong to a group. You are not on a planet. And you have no history, etc., etc., etc. These thoughts referring to that, all of that, discard them. Do not believe them. Drop them. Drop the thoughts. Let the thoughts go. There is to be natural replacement of such fiction with truth content. And this might seemingly radically change seemingly what the body, what happenings might occur with the body. And might seemingly radically change the content of thought. So it is not as simple as just dropping all thought. The processing will change the actual thought content and phenomenological occurrences. This needs to be practiced, though. It needs to be and it may not feel easy. But to God, the true self, it is effortless. God, manifest, activate, and so it is. Om, bless this convergence in all its phenomenal aspecting, seen and unseen. Om, Satyanandam. Om, Tat Sat. Om, God alone exists. God alone is reality. Om.